Thanks again, everyone, for tuning in tonight. My name's Kevin. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. One of the many events we're looking forward to is Melissa Broder in conversation with Catherine Morgan about Broder's new collection of poetry, Super Doom. That's this coming Tuesday, August 17th. And if you don't already do so, please follow us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Tonight, we are really excited to welcome two hometown favorites, Thea Prieto and Leni Zumas. Thea Prieto is a recipient of the Laurels Award Fellowship, as well as a finalist for the International Edwin L. Stockton Jr. Award and Glimmer Train's Short Story Award for New Writers. She writes and edits for Poets and Writers, Propeller Magazine, and The Gravity of the Things. And her work has also appeared at Long Reads, Entropy, and elsewhere. She lives in Portland, Oregon, where she teaches creative writing at Portland State University and Portland Community College. In her first book, From the Caves, environmental catastrophe has driven four people inside the dark throat of a cave. Sky, a child coming of age. Ty, pregnant and grieving. Mark, a young man poised to assume primacy. And Teller, an elder holder of stories. As the devastating heat of summer grows, so does the poison in Teller's injured leg and the danger of Ty's imminent labor, food and water dwindling while the future becomes increasingly dependent on the gleaned stories from Sky, which are pieced together from recycled knowledge, fragmented history, and half-buried creation myths. Prieto's From the Caves presents the past, present, and future in tandem, reshaping ancient and modern ideas of death and motherhood, grief and hope, endings and beginnings. She's joining us right here from Portland, Oregon tonight. Joining Prieto in conversation this evening is Leni Zumas. Zumas is the author of 3 books of fiction, the national bestseller Red Clocks, The Listeners, and Farewell Navigator. She teaches in the creative writing program at Portland State University and also joins us from here in Portland. This evening event will include an audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you would like to ask a question at any time. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd like to know the answer to, you can upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. And most importantly, please consider supporting Thea and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new book from us. A link to buy From the Caves, along with a link to Leni's books, will be shared in the chat a couple of times this evening. Thea, Leni, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We're excited to have you.
Thank you for having me. And I believe we're going to start the event with a little bit of me reading From the Caves to you all. I'm going to start by reading a portion of chapter 2. I think the only thing you have to know to jump right into the story here with me is that a lot happens in chapter 1, but I think all you need to know is that Green, one of the members of the group, has died, and the characters in From the Caves live inside a cave at the end of the world. And so this is the first time the reader has approached the caves and has started to walk inside. The tunnel walls widen beyond Sky's reach. He ducks again into complete darkness, and he knows he has reached the storeroom. He freezes in place with his arms still spread. No babies allowed, Mark always warned him. So Sky waits quietly on the brick step that has been permitted to him in the past, his senses perked to the upturned dirt nearby, the dense smell of water, the damp of growing things. He can also hear the padding of bare feet and fingernails scratching rock, Mark's movements quick and sure, even in blackness. He navigates the important room with such ease that Sky's eagerness dips, and a moment later, a blink of light. A brick slides out of the far wall and into Mark's orange-lit palm. The open rectangle of sunlight falls across the rows of large water drums, the chipped clay pots, and glints against the edges of glass jars stacked to catch evaporation. A peeling shard of mirror next to Sky helps jump the light across the room, and when he squints, he can just see the small hand-drawn scratches in the clay of the opposite wall, the long and detailed counting marks. "Don't touch these," says Mark, gesturing to one row of drums with cracked plastic lids. "This water is already filtered and separated, and it's ready to be boiled. All the new water goes in this barrel, and don't step there." Sky jumps back from his first step into the corner of the storeroom, and Mark drops to the ground, feeling the dirt where Sky's foot landed. A long quiet while Mark examines the squashed soil, his thick shoulders bunching. And when he stands, his hands are on his hips, his face glaring at Sky, who stands nervously, disappointed. "I've made a mistake already." "Where you just stepped," yells Mark, "is where all the summer roots are planted. See, that's the barrel that leaks. It goes on top." "It was Green's idea," adds Mark, his voice quieter. Another moment without speaking, except now the silence is heavy and leaking. Sky is almost grateful when Mark points out the scratches on the wall and begins explaining the different columns and tallies, when his voice has regained all of its familiar bitterness. Mark's words clip off the stone ceiling, driven down into the top of Sky's head, and he doesn't interrupt Mark, even though he already knows the symbols for counting days and seasons from the other tunnels. He doesn't know, though, the system for tracking the tides, the firewood supply, the water per person, the shredded tarps they use for washing, or the digging schedule. As Mark speaks, Sky's attention trails up the lighted wall, following a long line of square-shaped dots and fingernail-sized indents. Up close, he can finally see the line of dots continues to the ceiling, filling the high walls and winding all the way around the storeroom, hundreds and hundreds of small arcs and loops. In the hardest, oldest clay, where the walls are propped by iron beams, the dots are not dots at all, but tightly gathered and overlapping markings, an intricate pattern of grouped scratches. Each tiny figure is different than the one that follows, a string of shapes increasingly more complicated and interesting and exciting. "What are those?" interrupts Sky. "Don't you know what writing is?" says Mark. Sky ducks his face. "What's it mean?" Mark tilts his head to the side, itches his scalp. "I know what these mean." Mark points him to the other side of the room, where the long pattern tapers sharply to just a few short strings of figures. There, above a heap of corroded metal coils, the square dots are not intricate at all, only plain blunt punches in the clay. "That means Ty's name," says Mark, squinting and pointing to a single dot with 18 indents next to it. "And that's Green's name," says Mark, picking out another dot. "The 25 scratches next to his name means 25 years. Sky's ribs clutch his jumping heart, and he suddenly wants to lean across the water drums to trace Green, his name, his age, although he's sure Mark wouldn't allow it. Instead, he shapes the word Green in his mouth while looking at the imprint, moves his teeth and tongue as though Green might spring from this small, hushed language. But only his own memories live in Sky's garbled sadness, of Green spending time alone in the storeroom, Sky peeking unseen from the tunnel, cautious not to disturb him. "Time to think," Green called it, his body half hidden among the supplies, back shaking with prayers and sobs as his fingertips trace the walls. "And this scratch," thinks Sky, his fingers raised toward the clay. "This scratch is Green's name. It belongs to him. Green's voice, his determination and hope. They are supposed to be here, stamped in the storeroom, but the plain dot does not even hold the jagged and painful fact of Green's death. It is only a spot, a depression, no detail, no voice, no memory at all." Mark points to another dot on the wall. "And that's Mother's name," he says, and Sky shies from another dangerous past. He quickly notices, though, two other names in a line below hers, one name with 16 indents next to it, the other with 9 indents. "So when names are close, does that mean family?" says Sky, the words skipping unguarded from his lips. "It doesn't matter," frowns Mark, turning away. "Stop asking so many questions." "So that's your name," says Sky, pointing, "and that one's mine." "You know nothing about family," Mark snaps. Flipping around so fast, Sky stumbles backward into the dark shapes of the room. One of his hands plunges through a cracked lid into a water drum. A loud splash, warm drips down his arms against his chest, and Mark is screaming. Waste, he yells. You'll kill us wasting water. Sky jumps from the storeroom, his naked shoulders scraping the sides of the tunnel, loosening sand to the floor. In the main passageway, he
throughout this book, you're really bringing us close to both the natural world and the made world in ways that are so vivid that they can be uncomfortable. I mean, in the best way, right? It's like, are they going to get more water from the fog catcher? And I guess if you would start out kind of at that level, even in the sentence level, the level of description and how you went through this book writing it, how do you think about the relationship between fiction and texture of bodies and the world, and like, in what ways is that important to you as a writer?
Thank you. And thank you for all those kind words about my book. I'm glad to have you here and to be discussing my book. The role of language, especially in this landscape, because I think the different textures and descriptions, metaphor I like to evoke in writing definitely depends on the project. This one, it kind of depends on where the point of view is, but like a lot of it is limited by Sky's vocabulary. As much as he's fascinated by language, there is a kind of container that I had to work in terms of that language. I think the length of it can lend itself well. I think shorter forms of writing can add a lot of pop to word choices. Especially, I'm thinking, more readings that lend themselves more to a poetic reading. And as the writing in the storeroom is very blunt, sometimes the writing in From the Caves is very blunt as well. And I think the shorter form and that kind of focus, that zooming in, that I enjoy so much reading poetry or flash fiction. It can make even single syllable words really stand out or hold their sound. And so that was important. Language, the role of language in this piece was also kind of tricky. I had, from the beginning, I imagined the book would take place solely within the cave, that the characters could never leave the confines of the cave, and that the only way the readers, by way of the characters, would be able to access the outside world was through their stories and through language. And in that way, words and the different words they used or fixated on or learned from or failed to learn from had a huge bearing on their world. And so in that way, functioned very much like the tools that you can find in a storeroom. Yeah, and so word choice, especially with this project, was it was with that story within a story function. It could be one meaning within one lens, could be another meaning within another lens. So it was a fun experiment.
And before we go on, I just saw someone put a question in the chat, which is great, or in the Q&A rather. So after Thea and I talk for a little bit, I'll open it up to all of your questions. And so just throw any and all comments or questions into the Q&A. So you mentioned stories within stories, and myth is central to this book in various ways. And not just myth, but kind of the repetition or the dissolving or sort of recursion of different elements of myth throughout time and space and culture. And I was reading an essay you wrote, I think it was at the Kenyon Review, about some of the things that brought you to write From the Caves. And you were talking about especially classical Greek myth, and something I never knew was that Poseidon was the earthquake god. And so when there was an earthquake, that was something that shattered, but he was shattered something and broke a city wall, but he was also the horse god. So it became the horse broke the wall and the horse came in, and then that turned into the Trojan horse. And could you talk about your own relationship with myth and studying myth, and how it's important in this book?
Absolutely. And everyone, I hope I'm not melting on screen. It is 104 degrees here, and our AC went out a couple of days ago. So I'm here, glad to talk about my book, but also melting a little bit. So the stories within stories, they were definitely the oldest part of this writing project. I think a manuscript that looked more like closer to what that you might be all holding in your hands began to take form maybe 5 years ago, but the collecting of different Greek myths or creation myths, Genesis stories, origin stories from all over the world, I started doing that collecting pretty early. It was many years ago. So the stories that the characters are telling each other, in a lot of ways, not only the oldest part of From the Caves, but the oldest part of our culture in many ways. And so I loved finding these different links, similarities, recursions between myths. It might be birds as harbingers of death across many different cultures, bears as a feminine symbol, or cosmic eggs as being both the cracking open the beginning of the universe, but also closing it down. And so many other connections, flood mythologies, of course. And so I started to write them down, kind of collect them, look at the patterns. There were some of these stories that I had planned as adventure tales that might have been novel length in their own right. But when I discovered the characters and their cave at the end of the world, they became a new lens for those stories, a way to have a specific storyteller in mind, a specific situation by which they could apply those stories. And I think that the way that they repeat the stories, that repetition, and the way they return to stories is not too different from my first attraction to these stories, to what it means to write stories or to tell stories about the extreme beginning of the world and the extreme end of the world. I'm remembering one lesson that stuck out to me. It might have been that same Greek mythology class that you were reading about, that I was describing in the Kenyon Review piece. It was one of the archaeology components of the class, and they were talking about in Rome, a mosaic had been discovered that for years people had thought had depicted Jesus, but then after further investigation, they realized that it actually depicted Apollo. That created a lot of dark electricity in my mind. It's like, what is that? Because Greek mythology in particular leans so heavily into generational power, talking about the elemental creation, then Titans and all these other generations of gods before the Olympians come along. But of course, that tradition, or at least the way that mythology within that culture did not continue long enough to name it the next heir. And so the idea that Apollo, one of the more likely heirs of Zeus, and Jesus might be confused with each other in that mosaic was really fascinating to me. And thinking about not just the overlap of mythologies and the repetition, but also how they might connect, how they might move forward in that sense. And so it's a huge consideration, and I entertained some very lofty ideas for From the Caves early on. A lot of those satellite ideas fell away in favor of the characters and that kind of individual examination of what they were going through. And as a consequence, a lot of those stories, even the ones I had imagined might be novel length, got very much fragmented or pared down as they passed through what I believe to be, almost imagine like the characters being the crystal and the story being a beam of light. And on the other side, you get the light is refracted and it comes through fundamentally changed. And so whether the characters, the past generations that were telling the stories that are in From the Caves, there's many reasons that stories could get lost. There's many reasons stories could be remembered in very, excruciating detail. And there's reasons that they get changed. And I think for my characters, at least, it had a lot to do with what provided escapism from the terrible barren landscape I had given them, or what proved to be a source of information. What could be one more resource that in this landscape of extreme lack could actually be a source of information for them going forward.
I wonder if we are the heirs of, like in terms of people telling stories now and writing books and making films and, all kinds of narrative creation. Certainly we are inheriting forms and tropes and elements from the past, but a lot of us are thinking about death and apocalypse and climate disaster and the very things that were being written about in the myths that in some ways temporarily feel distant from us, but then in terms of their ingredients do not. And I really think that, as I said, kind of rereading this book this week in an Oregon that is today 104 degrees, but also, seeing on television the shores of a Greek island burning and, all kinds of disasters around the world, not simply like in our orbit. And it makes the book scarier to me, but also more alive in a way. I mean, not that it wasn't alive before, but for me, just as a person with a body and my my own fears about about scarcity and who gets affected disproportionately by the things that are going on outside. It was an intense read, and I wonder, could you talk a little bit about how you feel about this book coming out at our particular historical moment?
Yeah, and I share your concerns. I have a lot of thoughts these days about what it means to write a kind of post-apocalyptic scenario in 2021. And even before my family getting evacuated last year, being on warnings the years before, going through the year that we all went through, at least on the West Coast, between plague and drought and smoke and the list goes on. I thought a lot about it even before the pandemic. There was a moment, in a lot of ways, if I'm completely honest with myself, From the Caves was written by two different writers, one that was writing before my father passed away and one that was writing afterwards. And before, as I kind of mentioned before, was collecting creation myths and stories and creating these adventure tales. And then afterwards, very much needed to re-lens and get a new perspective on this, the idea of creation and endings and beginnings. And so I discovered my characters and how they were storytellers, and they were kind of going through something similar. And pretty early in the writing process, I think while I was still grappling with grief, I had imagined that the world wasn't dying of an apocalypse. It wasn't a post-apocalyptic setting. I imagined that it was dying of old age, that it had reached this natural arc, and I think I kind of wanted or needed that to be true at the time, that death was natural. There was this natural progression that not only I would, follow, and that my loved ones would follow, but that maybe even the planet itself would have this natural progression. But after writing through grief and writing those different components, I realized, like, my dad didn't die of old age. He died of an illness. Like, my friends that had passed away during that time, they didn't die of old age. They died of accidents. And the world is suffering. There's animals going extinct, and it doesn't take too many evacuations from California to realize, like, the world isn't dying of old age. Like, this climate change, like human, encroachment on the world is having a very major effect. And so I realized, after kind of taking a hard look at that I was no longer really writing about the planet coming to a ripe old age and dying a natural death. That I was seeing something around me that was very different than that. And so the book turned more towards describing a world that was a collage of apocalypses, apocalypses that do not necessarily seem too implausible these days. And I wanted that to kind of balance against the collage of creation myths that the characters were talking about. That what does it mean to talk about creation and in the midst of so many endings? And I wanted to specifically examine what these four characters would do about it, how they would live their lives, ask questions about what does it mean to live versus survive? What does it mean to remember the past in the present and then take that forward? And I hope that I'm kind of getting at your question, this idea of what does it mean to write post-apocalyptic fiction right now? And I think that with that kind of in mind already, before we got into the pandemic and environmental disasters became very prevalent, even more so, that I feel like post-apocalyptic fiction, like dystopian fiction, has a potential to, and more often than not, offers a warning. And it doesn't have to be, as otherworldly and futuristic as my novel. It could be like Red Clocks, where all we have to do is have one piece of legislation go through and look what the world can become. Or it could be even something smaller and just look at what that small change and ripple can do to create some kind of dystopian that we can learn from. But I worry, what happens to that dystopian fiction or the post-apocalyptic fiction when we're in a society that might be past the privilege of warnings? What do we do then? And I think just the fact that there is a post and post-apocalyptic is already very meaningful, and I can take hope from that, that we're no longer thinking of apocalypse, that it's actually a common consciousness to think about a post-apocalypse, something that comes after, no longer an apocalypse, capital A, or a capital END period, like that is the end. There's now a what about next? Yes, there was this cataclysmic change, but what comes next? What do we do about that? And so I kind of take hope in it being a kind of common idea that cataclysmic change doesn't necessarily have to be a cataclysmic end, that endings and beginnings can be kind of two sides of a coin, even when it comes to these kinds of disasters. So I'm holding on to that these days. We'll see where it goes. But yeah, I think post-apocalyptic fiction has played and is going to continue to play an imperative role in how we discuss these kinds of things.
Yeah. Do you think that your relationship to endings and beginnings and a kind of shifting or evolving way of thinking about kind of the trajectory of the earth or of people's lives, how is that reflected by the form of this book? Because you mentioned earlier, it's a novella, it's 137 pages, it's and it also, has to begin somewhere and end somewhere. And I'm not asking you to, tell people what the ending is, but in terms of form, like how did this compact form that takes place over, it's not, you're not starting in 1814 and ending at, in 2114, right? It's sort of very focused in. Yeah, could you talk about form and in this book?
Absolutely. And that cave did a lot of work in terms of that claustrophobia, that shrinking of time also ties pregnancy. And I think that largely, and this is true for a lot of my writing process, I've applied this kind of to different writing projects. And it wasn't too different for From the Caves, is that more often than not, I think I begin a writing project because of some kind of personal discovery or epiphany that feels like a destination. And for that reason, I tend to know how a story is going to end before I know how it'll begin. And I think it's because whatever kind of personal truth I've figured out that I would like to examine more, I know that I came to that for many different reasons. And so the same reason I had to work towards a lot of unknowns to get to a known, I figure my character should go through that as well. And, and as an extension, also my readers. And so I tend to kind of know where a piece is going, usually when I'm writing. Endings beginnings can be quite difficult for that reason. Actually, From the Caves, one of the first parts of this manuscript that could even be called recognizable was chapter 4. I began right in the center, right when the characters are stuck underground and they're trapped. And I started writing out of that and kind of knew where I was going to go. But otherwise, I wasn't quite sure how to get out of the cave. I mentioned earlier that that one of the first constraints was that the characters couldn't leave the cave. And I grew out of that. The characters gained more space to maneuver and move around. And I think it has a large part to do with that opening paragraph. The death of Green in the opening paragraph, in a lot of ways, was me being honest with myself, knowing that this project began as a writing through grief and a exploration of death, either individually or communally or at the planet, at a world scale. And so to put the death of a loved one in the very beginning was both the closing point for that character, but it's also what brought the entire story into being. It's what begins the piece. And so I didn't set out necessarily to write a novella. I think I just, well, for one, I kept writing short stories that felt like chapters. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm actually writing a novel. And then as I had all these chapters, I realized that the dominoes were already falling and they were all heading someplace. So I thought, okay, I think I know where this is going. And I love novellas. I was pleasantly surprised to find out it became a novella. So no disappointment at all. But yeah, the container. Yeah. But yeah, the container, I had to maneuver it around a little bit first.
There's a question in the Q&A that's kind of related to what we're talking about. So I'm going to share it. It's from Matt Rebholz. Hi, Matt. Would you mind talking a little bit about your MFA experience? I'm especially curious about the journey of a piece or a project from workshop to thesis to published work and how you felt through that long process.
Absolutely. From the Caves, as I mentioned, that there's parts of it that have been around for years. And then the first 2 chapters were very rough, were developed in a tin house summer workshop. And the first half of the manuscript was my thesis at PSU. I was very lucky to be, in the company of so many inspiring writers and inspiring mentors like Leni and all my other, professors at the MFA. In terms of actually developing the thesis, I knew I kind of had these opening chapters and this idea of where I was going. But I think I was in Nevada on a trip at one point. And I think at one point I knew, oh my gosh, I've got to write a thesis. It's my last year in the MFA. What am I going to do? And I was like, I've got all these ideas and they're all like this. And as you probably have all heard throughout this conversation, some of them are huge. Like, how do you tackle these ideas and bring them down to earth? And so I think at one point I was at my grandma's little tiny red house out in the middle of Nevada. It's a little 1-bedroom, like, boop, little oasis in the middle of the desert. And I was on the floor and I was laying down, I was lying, staring at the ceiling, like, what do I do? And I think I got it. Bing, I'm not sure how helpful map Bing is going to be to you, but I like took a napkin and I said, there's going to be 9 chapters. And I think if I start at 4, because I already had this, I have a chapter 4 at that point. If I have this place, I know I'm going to go forward, then I'll just let the other beginning chapters just float until I figure that out. A lot of discussion, talking with other writers was huge. I am totally indebted to the advice I got from folks in the MFA. I also was sharing chapters with friends in living rooms and also with my sister, with friends and family. Got a lot of input, and it might not be necessarily, it might not be a necessary process for you, Matt, but I found, maybe because of the nature of From the Caves, that how much of it relies on a kind of communal oral storytelling tradition, that the more people I pulled into that conversation, the more I felt that it gained gravity and was moving. And so seeking advice, making it public, I think is, and I mean, and I know that getting it published is one thing, but I kind of mean that in the strictest sense of the word of publishing. It's like, to make it public, I think is really important. Is there a part of his question that I missed? I want to make sure that
Well, no, you've answered part of it. The question was also, so it's part of your your thesis is part of this book, and then post MFA, what about the path to publication?
Oh yes, I submitted the piece to a couple different contests. It was a semifinalist in the Faulkner Wisdom Novel in Progress competition. The first chapter got anthologized in Pacific Review's Errant Mythologies anthology. And before it got picked up by Red Hen, I had pitched to agents, but maybe it was because after writing and tinkering with that first paragraph so much and looking at Green's death in that opening paragraph, that finally was like, I think I've got it. I'm like, that's it, this has got to get out in the world. So I started actively submitted first to agents, then to editors, sharing with friends along the way. When Red Hen picked it up, I actually withdrew from a lot of different places, and I got some very warm responses from agents and other editors that I hope to work with again in the future. And so even as the book was picked up and that journey kind of closed, it was nice to know that other avenues opened up at the same time. So I guess if I had to summarize it, just be persistent, just keep sending it, and in the meantime, a good conversation will build up.
Another question, this is from Jason. I'm really interested in your engagement with the naming language of the cave's inhabitants. Can you speak to your conceptions of the human urge to represent experience and identity through language? I also wonder how much you were inspired by prehistoric cave paintings.
Thank you, Jason. The characters were developed in an interesting way. As you pointed out that, their names. And I mentioned earlier that there was a switch, a hinge in the writing process after my father passed, and I really needed a new perspective in life, but also specifically when it came to storytelling. So in a lot of ways, the characters kind of taught me how to do storytelling again in that way, how to approach stories. And at the most basic level, they were very simple, one-dimensional characters in the beginning. I thought of sometimes Sky and Teller as simply nouns, and practice moving them around in the sentence that way. I thought of Mark and Ty as mostly verb-like entities and kind of moved them around that way. As they got more—
And Green's the adjective.
And Green would be the adjective. And he's not around for too long, but he definitely describes a lot of the character's experience as a consequence. As the characters became more developed, they started to, I will say that they were still not three-dimensional, still very stick figure, but they started to represent the different stages of grief. Mark representing anger, Ty sorrow, Teller bargaining, and Sky first denial and then acceptance. And I found that was a kind of useful way to write, to continue to write, specifically this story. And I want to say that, and I hope that they become more complex and three-dimensional through the writing process as I learned their desires and goals. But they can still, I hope, fit into the archetypes of the stories they tell: mother, father, child, elder, and hopefully, get into those roles and elbow them open a little bit and disrupt them, and change them, even as that they are leaning into stories that includes those archetypal roles. Um, there was another couple parts of that question that was fascinating, and I know I kind of went down the road of talking about characters.
What about prehistoric cave paintings?
Prehistoric cave paintings. I remember there was a friend on social media that had shared about caves that were discovered, that had never been discovered before, with a lot of different hieroglyphics and pictures, specifically of bears, and what that meant to have lions on the outsides and bears on the inside of the cave. And so those caves in particular were a great inspiration for, as I was developing the mythologies in the final chapters of From the Caves, for sure.
Let's see, there's another question from Rachel. What are some of your favorite dystopian and or post-apocalyptic authors? Did you see their influence on you during your writing process?
Definitely. I've got to say Red Clocks, the characters that are all kind of moving amongst each other in the ways that they both highlight their differences and stand on their own, but also lean into each other in interesting ways. That was very much an inspiration. Another big inspiration was The End We Start From by Megan Hunter. It's just a short little book, and it also pairs motherhood with the end of the world, specifically flood mythology, and water as being a source of creation, but also a source of destruction. That was a huge inspiration, specifically because, and we did get to, I got to talk with that author for Propeller Books. So if you'd like to know more about how we talked about, endings and beginnings specifically, please go check that out. But she does begin the book with a quick quote from, or maybe she gives an acknowledgement to this little book called Beginnings, Creation Myths of the World, by Penelope Farmer. And I picked that up. I was like, I haven't read that one. And I think I devoured it in like 2 hours. It's just a little book, but it describes creation myths from around the world, apocalyptic stories from around the world, the creation of fire, the creation of man, creation of woman, little tiny chapters with just these little paragraphs. Fascinating. I highly recommend that one. Not necessarily post-apocalyptic fiction, but you can go to the source of, where are these imaginative stories that in our culture that are part of our culture, where do they come from?
It's interesting to think about, where does an archetype or a sort of mythology end, and a caricature, a stereotype, a sort of calcified emblem of begin. And specifically in terms of motherhood, I'm thinking of Ty's character, and I definitely see that character as kind of elbowing open the idea, the form, the kind of huge cultural edifice that is like mother, right? Can you talk a little bit about her character and her relationship with her pregnancy and the rest of the world around her?
Sure. I for a while entertained the idea that the story would be told from Ty's point of view. I thought that could have been a really interesting and necessary point of view to be hearing from someone that maybe has had all of this story and symbolism and role heaped on her, only for her to be like, oh my God, like this is the most awful thing ever. I don't want it. And to be going through her own personal grief and having that be maybe sometimes sidelined or made secondary. There was a lot to explore there with Ty, and I find her to be fascinating still. I think it's actually a mundane reason why I didn't end up writing from Ty's point of view, mostly because I liked, for one, I began writing with Sky's point of view because that child's point of view was or basically the perspective of someone who is still learning was very useful for me as a writer who is still learning what the story would be itself. And so it helped to kind of have that guide in a sense. The reason I didn't switch out of that is I thought that that might be a useful guide for the reader as well, that while our main character is learning, so the reader gets to learn avongside about more about this world and what it means and its implications. One of the more mundane reasons also is because I was afraid that by keeping that child perspective and then having Ty being the child perspective, that making her too young might have predetermined her death when it came to when she went into labor. And so I didn't want her odds to be set. Kind of wanted it to be her choice, not, this entirely symbolic, kind of avalanche coming down on her. And I hope I achieved that. I know that it's hard not to have that symbolism in the room and fall into it when their stories are what they are. But I hoped that for Ty, and I hoped that for for motherhood in general From the Caves, that it's something more than than an archetype.
It definitely is. And it's one of the things that's very powerful about the representation is that as we are following someone's pregnancy or the imminent, arrival of the birth, we're thinking, or I'll speak for myself. I'm thinking, like, what is the world like rather than the whole narrative, oh, a new life is always like so happy and great and blah, 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 like yada, yada. It's like, what is the world for, like, what is this new life going to do in this world? And so it's not, it's sort of taking the like hopeful, triumphant arc away, but it's also increasing the suspense, right? Of like, for all of these characters, like what is going to happen to them, and what is their survival going to look like?
Sure.
There's another. Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, go ahead. I was going to ramble.
Ramble away.
I was just thinking there's nothing like, there was a couple different clocks From the Caves between Teller's sickness and also Ty's and pregnancy, but there's also a huge time clock on this planet as well. Like, how much longer can it be sustained? And I didn't want the Ty's pregnancy and the survival of the world to overlap so much. That seems like a lot to put on any one pregnancy. But I think that those clocks do kind of speak to each other in that sense.
There's a question from Kayla. What influenced your ideas for the tools used by the characters, i.e. the fog net or growing vegetables near a leaking water drum?
Oh, I had seen a couple of shows about in Mongolia, people collecting water out through fog, like setting them up on the bluffs. But of course, fog nets are used in vineyards. People have been using those for years, sometimes during drought, sometimes continuously. Figuring out what the characters were going to eat was kind of a big one. I remember being in a PSU workshop where a peer kindly asked, like, where do they go to the bathroom? Like, it was like, oh, okay, we don't, just get to hang out. Another, big, reason to get the characters out of the cave is, as much as it could be a philosophical kind of, experiment to keep them contained in the cave, the real world imperative really kind of comes about pretty quickly. And I wanted it to be more than just a cerebral experience. I wanted it to be bodily, maybe even violently so. And because I don't think that is something to be glanced over when we start talking about catastrophes of this magnitude. And so thinking about what they would eat, how they would eat, I give a lot of thought to the storeroom. And I think the compromise was to have their little garden cellar and their water, and to have the writing on the wall all be there in the same place. That there was going to be something symbolic, but is extremely practical going on at the same time. I hope that gets at your question, Kayla. We can talk about it soon.
So as the book just came out, and so obviously you're going to be in this book, and it's traveling through the world for a bit, but your writing practice, currently, what are you working on? Or, well, you don't have to tell us what you're working on. That's kind of sometimes a hard question, but can you describe just your writing practice today and how you, like, where it fits and sort of what is useful to you in terms of sustaining a writing practice?
Thank you for that, because it also kind of holds me accountable to, like, this is an ongoing practice. It's I have to, be thinking about other projects as well, and I want to. I feel like, and maybe I kind of described it earlier when I described a trip to Nevada where there was this aha moment, and I was able to do a very basic outline on a napkin. And I know that's because a huge part of my writing process is also verbal. I have a lot of conversations with people about stories, either repeating stories we like from our personal past, or repeating information that we had learned in our own worlds through various media. And those conversations, I feel, are a big part of my writing practice as well. This kind of letting all the words and conversations with friends and family, but also writers, reading enthusiasts, literary enthusiasts, and just letting it all, like dust, start to swirl and see what collects and gains gravity till finally there might be this system of ideas that that I can sit down to write. So I guess to answer your question about my writing practice, what I'm doing right now, most of the writing I do is very early in the morning. I kind of like how quiet it can be before the thoughts of the day braid my focus up and send it elsewhere. But a lot of it also exists in the form of conversation and gathering ideas. I've got a couple of different nonfiction stories that I have been writing and tinkering with recently. So who knows, maybe the next project will be a little bit more nonfiction based.
Cool. I just want to let people know that we're wrapping up around 6. So if you have questions for Thea that you haven't asked, oh, here's one. Okay. Carolyn, hi, Carolyn. Your thoughts on conversation form and characters as parts of speech have me thinking a lot about the details of language in this book. I'd love to hear your thoughts around sound and prosody as you were writing. And congrats, I'm so excited about this book.
Oh, thank you. Sound and rhythm. I realized kind of maybe late in the game that sound is something that's extremely important to me. I can be a very visual person, and so as I write, I tend to think parts of speech and kind of building it. I once used the metaphor, I think, in a creative writing class of like putting different train cars on a train and kind of building it up. But that's not entirely right, I think, now for my writing practice, at least, is that I have a voice in my mind that's the reader, and I have a voice in my mind that is the writer. And I think we all have this to a certain capacity. There's, when you're reading and you have to read something by the end of the day, it's like there's one kind of voice in our minds reading it, and it's kind of like loud. And then when you actually drop into a piece of writing, it can be like the writing falls away and we're just drifting through. I can feel those different levels when I'm writing too. One of them is like a plotting kind of visual sense. But when I fall into rhythm, that's when the sentences really kind of come quickly. And thank you for pointing out that there is a kind of rhythmic or sound quality to the writing, because that's something I'm still learning about.
It's so interesting you mentioned the reader's voice and the writer's voice. Can you talk more about what the reader voice, like, is that linked to imagining a kind of ideal reader, or at least an imagined reader that is waiting for these sentences? Or how are you aware of the reader?
I'm aware of them in the sense of building dialogue. I think from the caves in particular, I thought of the reader as being in every room, listening in, and maybe every now and then Sky would, when he dropped into first person, would say something as an aside to the reader, but otherwise that the reader would be hanging out in the rooms, listening in, maybe just a fly on the wall. But I think of readers pretty consistently when I'm writing, definitely when I'm editing, and yeah, there's a lot of different relationships that can be built with readers. This one in particular, that's how I envisioned it, but I think all my different writing projects have different relationships to readers.
Have you been reading anything lately that's been exciting or noteworthy to you?
Oh, what have I've been reading a lot. I'm trying to pick out something in particular. I'm not sure how much this plays towards From the Caves, but I just read Dante's Purgatory. My brother got me an interesting translation. And so thinking less about the creed and more about the sheer kind of world building that goes into that has been making me think a lot about darkness and the kind of scale. It also is very humbling because of how small my world is kind of in comparison to that. I'm trying to think. Otherwise, like I've been reading a lot of William Gibson, a lot of cyberpunk. So who knows? Maybe my next piece is like, if I'm not building up these kind of, hellish scapes, then maybe I'll be building these futuristic, more fun cyberpunk scapes.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And I encourage everyone listening to read this book. It's an extraordinary book. Thanks, Thea.
And thank you everyone for coming on out. This is great.
Thanks, Leni, for doing this tonight with us. Thanks, Thea, for doing the talk about this beautiful book, From the Caves. This is what it looks like right here. And and look inside. There's a really cool book plate that Thea printed herself, right? With your sister?
For my sister, yeah.
Yeah. And Leni, thanks. It's her best-selling novel. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm going to put the link to our YouTube channel in the chat. There it is. And you can check that out. You can view our past events. And this event will probably be popping up there tomorrow sometime. So if you have friends that missed it and want to watch it, they can watch it tomorrow, starting there. Thanks everyone for jumping in the chat and saying hello. And one last time, I will also cut and paste Thea's book in the chat there. So click on that and go to that page and support her book and support us. And thanks again, everyone, for coming out, and have a great night.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks.